instead that at lunchtime I will give this speech now. And as you said, the topic is synchronized nasal ventilation. And I want to immediately underline that most of the data that I will show you were obtained in collaboration with Fate Fratelli Hospital in Rome. So I work in University Hospital, but most of this data were obtained and working together to Fate Fratelli. Rocco Agostino is the chief. And a brief introduction, we all know the role of the mechanical ventilation and the pathogenesis of BPD. And we also know how useful are nasal CPAP and surfactant, but despite these two beautiful tools, 30–40% of the preemies develops respiratory failure, and this percentage increases obviously with the decreasing of the gestational age. So most of so high percentage needs mechanical ventilation, and moreover there is another problem. A percentage more or less the same, 30–40% of this baby fails extubation and needs to be reintubated. Clearly, these very high percentages stimulated and prompted the interest in a new technique, and a less invasive technique of ventilation, that is an IPPV. That it means this is a technique that combines the CPAP with some mandatory breath. So I divided my speech in blocks. The first one is on technique, and so there are several points. The first point is the choice of interface. This is a very important point, but the answer, I think, is very easy, because theoretically we have three possibilities: short binasal prongs, nasopharyngeal tube, and nasal mask. But we know there are several papers who tell us that the nasal prong are the best device, more comfortable, with a higher rate of success. And I want also to underline that we have really a long experience with this device. This is exactly the first international paper in which nasal prong are described for the treatment of the respiratory distress of the newborn, and was printed in '74, and one of the authors was Agostino. As I told you, now is the chief of the hospital with which we collaborate. And a few days after, a few years after, but you see, we are in the '81, more than 20 years ago. This is the first paper on a nasal intermittent positive pressure ventilation. In this case, this technique was used in very low birth weight infants for the treatment of apnea of prematurity. I want to remind you that we were in pre-surfactant era, and none of these babies had a severe respiratory distress. Most of them had an underlying disorder. Sepsis was the most common. But since at the time, was clear that the synchronization between the ventilator and the baby was very important to achieve good results. It's possible to see here, these are the wave of ventilators, square wave as used at that time. And this is the thoracic impedance of the baby. And in that case, as you can see, there is a perfect synchronization. And at that time we tried, when the baby had a good respiratory drive, we tried to synchronize the ventilator to the rhythm of the baby, changing the inspiratory time and the expiratory time, in order to have more or less the same rhythm with the ventilator, to achieve a good synchronization. And this is a very important point, the very important question, non-synchronized or synchronized. I have already given the answer. So we think that the synchronized is much better. And the reason is very simple, and now I'm going to explain. Clearly, non-invasive ventilation means that there is not a connection, a tube, between the pipes of the ventilator and the airways. And another thing that you have to think is that the larynx during the respiratory cycle is not quiet. You all know, for example, that during expiration, the glottis closes, that is grunting. But as now I'm going to show you, during the inspiration, there is a remarkable opening of the glottis. This is a brief film done in a baby with a mild RDS. You see, this is the glottis, inspiration, 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 inspiration. You see how fast is the movement, how the glottis opens during inspiration and how it closes during the expiration. So it's clear that we have to, it's very important to deliver the positive pressure when the glottis is open. Otherwise, the result that we will have is that the flow will be diverted toward the stomach. This is a very, but at the same time, very important reason. And so now we can, the third point is the triggering devices for synchronization. And currently, we can use two different techniques. The first one is the grasping pneumatic capsule, which is a capsule that you have to stick on the abdomen of the baby, and it detects the increase of the pressure due to the contraction of the diaphragm. It has some nice advantages because the response time is very short, and there is no dead space, so there is not a connection between the pipes of the ventilator and the bronchs. But the truth is that this device is not really reliable, auto-triggers very, very easily. And moreover, it's not easy to find the right place, because you know that also, especially the very low birth weight infants have a paradoxical movements of the rib cage. So if the sensor is placed in this shaded area, could be that inspiration is detected as expiration. So it's not really reliable. Moreover, recently I found this paper which tell us that in premature infants up to 60 of breath start with diaphragmatic contraction in advance of glottis opening. So this means that the short response time of this device could be a disadvantage despite an advantage, because when the diaphragm starts to move, the glottis is still closed. This is the reason why, being the flow, the specific signal of spontaneous breathing, we try to develop a flow sensor. And clearly, what's not very easy, because there are two very important disadvantages. The first one is an increase in dead space. You can see this is a very, very low birth weight infants. This is the first device that, the first prototype. So you can see that there is a very high dead space. But with time, we understood that this advantage is more theoretical than real, because being a pressure in the pipes, there is a continuous washout of the gas from mouth. Moreover, we have understood that the expiratory flow is always from mouth. So practically, in other words, there is no rebreathing. But this is another problem, very, very big problem, because this means that the sensor, the flow sensor, detects the inspiratory flow but doesn't detect the expiratory flow because it leaves the airways from mouth. So if you put here a normal flow sensor, after a few breaths, you will see the flow line to go up, 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 and that after a few breaths, the beep sounds, the alarm sounds. So we were able to develop a software by which after every inspiration, the flow signal is automatically reset to 0. And this flow sensor, so I forgot this detail, this is a very, very simple differential pressure transducer. So there is a small resistance inside this tube. Another problem is that for very low birth weight infants, this device is a little too big, and also sometimes if it's not well fixed, it can be not very comfortable for very small infants, and so we try to improve. And this one was the next device, a smaller, lighter, but now we have reached these results. You see, this is the last model. It's a very, very small. The baby is 500 grams because this baby was treated recently in a Fate Bene Fratelli. It's a newborn 500 grams, and you can see how small is now the device and how simple to fix. Much different than before. So I really hope that we are in the right way. This is a picture of the screen. This is the positive pressure. The range that we use is in the range of between 10 and 25 centimeters of water. And this is the signal of the flow. All the experts will easily recognize that it's a very, very strange signal of the flow because there is the inspiration but not the expiratory phase. And this is exactly because the expiratory flow leaves the airways from mouth. If you close the mouth of the baby, the expiration will appear. This is the trigger line, and when the inspiratory signal crosses the trigger line, the ventilator starts. It's possible also to recognize the assisted breath because are green by the mandatory breaths that are white, but in this picture are all green. These are the parameters that we usually set, but are the usual parameters we use in mechanical ventilation of the newborn. The inspiratory time 0.335 and 4, 6 the PEEP. There is clearly a backup rate, and the flow variable between 6, 10, sometimes also 12. It depends by the weight and by the pressure you want, the weight of the baby and the pressure you want have in the circuit. This is a brief film of many years ago. It's possible to see the movement of the rib cage and the synchronized waves on the ventilator. So this was done, was one of the first baby treated, and so a funny thing that this baby was the nephew of the chief of the Italian Society of Neonatology. So in any case, he succeeded, and so there were no problems. Otherwise, it could have been a really bad advertising. And now, physiological, I described the interface, the machine, and now the sensor, the flow sensor, the physiological implications. And I start with the effects on ventilation. This is something that always with the group of Fate Bene Fratelli, Camilla Gizzi, she is there in the first row, and Paola Papov. We compared the effects of the nasal synchronized ventilation with the positive, the nasal the CPAP, the nasal CPAP after extubation in very low birth weight infants. These are the data of the babies. Every baby was, every newborn was his own control. So the techniques were applied in randomized way. So we recorded the respiratory rate, and this is very easy. And this esophageal pressure is less easy, but esophageal pressure as an index of the effort of the baby. And to this, clearly, we inserted air-filled balloon catheter in the lower third of the esophagus. And then tidal volume. This is very difficult because this is an open circuit. This is the reason why we use this soft rubber jacket platysmograph. The chest volume changes were translated in volume. And this, I want to underline that this is a technique that was already tested by Professor Milner. And then PCA2. And these are the results that the numbers, a significant increase of tidal volume, a significant decrease of the esophageal pressure. You see 1/3 less, so less effort, a significant decrease in respiratory rate. That is a good sign, but at the same time, an increase in minute volume and a decrease in transcutaneous CO2. This is a nice picture of that paper, in which during the recordings of one baby during the period of ventilation nasal CPAP and nasal ventilation. So the first, it's possible to do 3 remarks. The first, that we checked very often the main trigger response time, that this is the value, 65. So in any case, was always under 100 milliseconds, which is the cutoff. And it's possible to see here in CPAP, here nasal ventilation, this is the esophageal pressure, the pressure in the circuit, and the volume. It's possible to see here that there is less effort, so less deflection of the esophageal pressure, but at the same time, a remarkable increase of tidal volume. This is a picture taken in the same baby. And this is another very important point, another very important phenomenon that we check very often. Again, the pressure of the ventilator, the esophageal pressure, and the tidal volume. These are all synchronous breath. The baby, this is the spontaneous effort of the baby, the ventilator starts, and so this is the tidal volume. You can see that in this asynchronous breath, in this mandatory breath, the effect on the ventilation is practically zero. It's very, very low. And luckily, this year, just in the last months, were printed 2 papers written by very important professors. One is Bancalari, who confirm many of this data. This is a very recent paper of his group, effect of synchronization during nasal ventilation in stable preterm infants. And as you can see here, when the wave of the ventilator synchronous with the, again we have esophageal pressure, with the effort of the baby, if compared with this breath that is not assisted, there is a less inspiratory effort, a significant reduction of the inspiratory effort. They didn't find in this trial any increase of the tidal volume. This could be due to 2 reasons. In our trial, the trial that we have done 10 years ago, at that time we used a PEEP of 3-4 centimeters of water, perhaps a little bit too low. But another reason could be that our patients were not stable patients, because they were just disconnected by the ventilator. They were shifted from the ventilator to nasal ventilation, and in this case, all the baby treated were stable preterm infants who were quietly in CPAP. Perhaps this could be one reason. Always the same paper. In this case, we can see what happens when we have a wave that is not synchronous with the effort of the baby. In this case, there is a wave exactly during the expiratory phase, and as you can see here, we have during the expiratory phase, we have a positive pressure. That is active expiratory effort, active expiration, and this provokes also an alteration of the spontaneous respiratory pattern, because it's easy to see that there is a remarkable prolongation of the expiration. And moreover, there is another recent paper by Davis, which he found that when, again, he described that when the ventilator wave are synchronous with the spontaneous breathing of the baby, there is an increase of the tidal volume, and also of the a little increase of the inspiratory time. Clearly, we were very happy to read these few lines, that only mechanical inflation delivered during expiration produced chest inflation. So practically it's the confirmation that what we detected many years ago was right. And now effects on the thoraco-abdominal synchrony. This is a very important point. This is a very nice and elegant paper done by Kinseman some years ago. This is a scheme of the rib cage of the lung. This is the diaphragm. He placed two strain gauges, one around the chest wall and one around the abdomen. And these are the recordings, the signals. And this is the signals when the two structures work in unison. And this is the integration of the two signals. So this is a narrow and positive loop. But you know that there is very often this phenomenon that the rib cage has an inward collapse during the inspiratory phase. And so it means that the diaphragm must increase the movement, must increase the work of breathing in order to maintain the same tidal volume. And these are the signal. This is a baby as you with breathing, spontaneous breathing with a tracheal tube and CPAP. This is something that we never have to do, we never must do, because there is a terrible increase of the resistance and there is a complete distortion of the signal. What does it mean? It means that when there is the contraction of the diaphragm, there is an inward collapse of the rib cage. So all the work of breathing is completely useless or partially useless. With nasal CPAP, there is an improvement, but this open loop, it means that in any case there is not a good synchronization. There is a time lag between the contraction of the diaphragm and then the contraction of the rib cage. It's possible to go back to a physiologic situation like in here if the breath is assisted with synchronized ventilation. And there is also the work of breathing was also measured by a guy. This is another paper. He very simply demonstrated that with the synchronized positive pressure ventilation of 14 centimeters of water was possible to decrease the work of breathing of about 25–30%. That more or less is the same results we had, because in our trial we had the decrease of the no work of breathing, of the esophageal pressure of 1/3. And now I will show just a few trials. I will show only our trials because there are many on this topic. So clearly, this technique was used initially as a secondary mode, so after extubation in the recovery phase of RDS. And this is a paper that we printed a couple of years ago. As you clearly, we compared after extubation nasal CPAP, 31 babies with nasal synchronized ventilation. The birth weight and gestational age are quite low, and you can see that the baby treated after extubation with nasal CPAP, the percentage of failure is 39%. That more or less is the usual failure rate, but decreases to 6% with nasal synchronized ventilation. You can see also less days of mechanical ventilation, and also this is very important. Also the incidence of BPD is not far from being significant. 6% versus 22%. Perhaps with an higher number of baby, this number could be significant. And I want also to underline another thing, that the two baby who failed in this group failed for reasons due to lung problems, respiratory problems. In this group, so for hypoxia, in this group, 12 baby failed, and 3 for hypoxia, but 9 for hypercapnia and 5 for apnea. So 9 failed for reason due to bad ventilation. And this is a summary of the more recent data. And so there are some of the most important papers in this field. And as you can see, the extubation failure is all the way around 35, 50, and 45%. And the decrease with nasal synchronized ventilation is always significant. This is our trial. So more recently, there were many trials to use this technique as primary mode of ventilation, especially after surfactant. I will not show you, but there are several papers was printed with good results, especially from the group of Bandari. And he also reported a decrease of incidence of BPD. But I can just to show you a small trial, a preliminary trial that Camilla Giccia has done. And she compared these two groups of baby. Of all these baby had RDS, and some of them were treated with Insure and nasal CPAP. So it means when the baby reached the FiO2 of 0.4, the baby was intubated, surfactant, extubated, and then CPAP. In this group, intubation, surfactant, extubation, and then nasal ventilation. Here again, in the group treated with CPAP, a failure of about 40%, 43%. Just one baby failed in this group. So this technique linked with surfactant could really reduce a lot the incidence of extubation. So the numbers are small, but I showed you because this is interesting, just to give you an example where we are trying to go. In any case, in this group, there were 3 newborns who still had oxygen 36 weeks, none in the group of nasal ventilation. The last point is for the treatment of prematurity. And again, these are the preliminary data by Camilla Gicci. She gave me yesterday the slides. I hope that I will be able to explain them well. So she studied the efficacy of nasal synchronized ventilation in treating prematurity, and she studied 10 infants with less of 34 weeks of gestational age. All were receiving caffeine, and this baby was treated with 3 different modes of nasal pressure support. Every trial at a length of 6 hours. So nasal CPAP, nasal intermittent positive pressure ventilation, synchronized nasal ventilation. As you can see, these babies had a quite low gestational age and birth weight. It is the age and the weight at the study some weeks later after extubation. And these are the definitions: apnea, absence of expiratory effort longer than 15 seconds, bradycardia below the 80 beats minutes. And so these are the parameters. Nasal CPAP, the PAP or PIP always 5-6 centimeter, and again a positive peak respiratory pressure ranging from 15 and 22. And the usual inspiratory time. She had these results. There was a significant decrease of the rate of apneas with the synchronized ventilation. No difference in the two groups of nasal CPAP and nasal intermittent ventilation. And also there was no bradycardias in this group. And perhaps if you have other questions on these slides, I think that Camilla could answer, because I don't know all these details, because she has just finished this to set up this data. But I think these preliminary data are really, really interesting, that this technique can be useful for this treatment. And so the conclusion are there is a clear evidence that nasal synchronized ventilation is better than CPAP in preventing extubation failure. There is some evidence that this technique can be used as primary mode of ventilation and for treatment of apnea of prematurity. Possible complications are common, but I want also to underline that in my pediatric intensive care, we are using clearly with nasal prongs a little bit larger. We are using the same technique for treatment of bronchiolitis. We use this technique in children and infants with a weight less than 5 kilos, and it works very well. We are having very good results. Clearly, further larger trials are needed, but as you know, the end of the trial is just a beginning of a new one, but this is possible because I have all these very good collaborators. Thank you.
What was your triggering flow? The triggering flow, the synchronization is dependent on the trigger, right? The baby should trigger. What was the limit, the trigger limit then? Because you have to set in the, at least with the ventilator that I can, you have to set the trigger limit.
Yeah.
How does the machine know that the baby is inspirating now?
Sorry.
How does the ventilator acquaint us that the baby is triggering? So he has to make some inspiratory flow, right?
Yes.
And what in some ventilators you have to set up the triggering.
Yes. But, there is a scale that can be bigger or smaller, but practically we done in very low birth weight infants. We do this looking the baby and looking the line of the trigger level, because in very low birth weight infants is very, very close to the zero line. So we do this clinically, because in the last models it's also possible to, when the ventilator is activated, there is a beep, so you can look at the baby and move the sensibility of the trigger level, looking at the baby. When the baby breathes, you hear the beep, and so if this happens several times, it means that you are close to a good synchronization. But because we are speaking of a baby of 500 grams, sometimes really the flow line is over the trigger line. So in some way I could say that the ventilator starts not when the line crosses, but when the line si allontana, disconnects from the the best thing is to do this clinically. But in any case, there is the measure if you want, but we don't use.
Can I just ask you for a bit more clarity on that? So you're measuring flow with a differential pressure transducer. In order to pick up the baby's breath, you have to be able to monitor the pressure difference across your device of the beginning of a breath. In a very premature baby, you might have 0.5 mil, maximum 1 mil, and yet you've got a flow going through there with CPAP of several liters a minute. So what sort of pressure transducer is that? Is that a very low pressure transducer? Is it capable of detecting, you know, very small pressure changes? I still find it very difficult to see how that pressure transducer can detect the pressure difference caused across there of a very small volume out of the total flow that's going in. So can you give us any idea of what is the smallest tidal volume you can detect with that pressure transducer with, say, a flow of 5 liters a minute?
Well, the whole 5 liters, 5.
No. We've measured it. So let's say you've got 6 liters going through the circuit. There is a large flow through the device, through the baby, out of the mouth. Yeah, we've measured it. You can do it. Take a bubble bottle system, binasal CPAP, bubbling, turn the flow down until the bubbling just stops. Hey, you've still got flow. That's the flow going in through the CPAP and out of the mouth. And it can be anything from 3 liters up to 8 liters. It's a big flow going through the front. Yeah, but you don't close the mouth. And his pictures have got the baby with his mouth open.
With the prongs connected, because the prongs are very high resistance.
So let me just come back to the question. What volume of gas can that differential pressure transducer measure in that system? It's got to be very sensitive.
Yes, it is. It is because I think we can detect the movement of 1 milliliter. How did we choose the first step? How do we choose the right resistance? The resistance inside the flow sensor has the same diameter of the tracheal tube that baby would need it if intubated. So at 2.5 for a very low, or 3 for a bigger one. But the length is only 3 milliliters and not 10 centimeters. And it's difficult. I can show you because we've seen that it works. It's very clear, the signal on the monitor. And we did also some experimental trials, and we have seen that it was possible to detect 1 milliliter volume.
Let me just maybe comment a little bit. We were just at a meeting in Bologna where the whole meeting for 2.5 days was on non-invasive ventilation, and to take a step back and just review that a little bit, I think it's first of all, how many people are using non-invasive? How many people are using CPAP? Okay, everybody. How many people are using non-invasive strategies with CPAP? So far fewer people. But it turns out that there's lots of ways that people are thinking about this now, and that's what's really good because there's a lot of innovation. So this is an innovative way to try to do this with this particular device that's measuring tidal volume to synchronize. There's a lot of people who use ventilators that don't synchronize, and use it and think it works pretty well without synchronization. There are folks in Utah who are using a device which they call a pneumo, whatever, I can't even think of what it is, but they're using high frequency oscillation through nasal prongs to try to sort of do high frequency oscillation with CPAP. And they can do that very effectively with preterm lambs with respiratory distress syndrome, and that's just coming into clinical trial. There's a device that was described in pediatric research recently, which is just a bubble CPAP device, but at the bottom of the tube, that instead of the tube going into the water 5 centimeters, it goes in further and then there's an angle. And that angle changes the pressure profile such that you can ventilate preterm rabbits who are paralyzed and have saline lavage lungs. So you can use the CPAP device and just ventilate the animal in a paralyzed animal, which is, now that's with an endotracheal tube. But it's interesting that you can get enough pressure variation to do that, and then we can all argue about, is bubble CPAP better than flow drivers versus ventilator-mediated CPAP. So there's a lot of people doing a lot of different things, which I think are going to be innovative and are going to keep more and more babies off of ventilators. The other approach is to use what's called NAVA, neural assisted ventilatory, which is basically timing the ventilator off the diaphragm. And as I understand, the catheters for that really aren't optimal yet for tiny babies, but that's a new therapy that'll be developed. So I think all of these things are pushing us to think about non-invasive approaches to ventilation, and this is a very interesting one. Yeah, I think this is a little bit like the experience with CPAP. If your nurses believe in CPAP, then you can make it work. And if you're used to using this ventilator and you think it's going to work, then you can make it work. All these are tricky. I don't know if other people have other comments. Colin or Dr. Moretti?
No, he wants.
Point was not to make it critical, I think this way of ventilating babies is very good. The point was not to make it critical, but the point was to understand how you do it, because I find it good, and we have some problem with the triggering. So I'm looking for some answers to our problem with triggering, and I thought that maybe I could find it here. Not because I don't think the method is good.
So how to detect if you have problem with triggering? But the concepts are more or less the same that you can have during the ventilation of the baby intubation. So if clearly, for example, if you see that the ventilator starts immediately, you think that is auto-triggering. If you see that the baby is breathing and the ventilator doesn't start, the sensitivity is too low. More or less, there is any difference from this and ventilation trigger in a baby intubated. And the concepts are the same. It's unbelievable. I don't know. Perhaps at the beginning of the breath, the flow is really fast, but also very small. It detects really also very small changes of the volume.
There is also the issue of that when you're using nasal prong delivered ventilation, there's the issue of making sure that the prongs are always in the nostrils. If they're not in the nostrils, you won't either deliver, nor will you deliver or generate a trigger mechanism. It sounds pretty obvious. The number of times I do a ward round, and the first thing I pick up on is the fact that the prongs aren't in. But of course, the machine won't tell you that because the machine is generating a pressure. So that's a big problem. And that's one of the reasons why the innovation out there actually interested me, because it's looking at making sure the prongs stick in the nostrils. If you don't have the things in the nostrils, you just can't do anything.
So if I understood you, says that that could be that the problem if the prongs are out, you don't see.
You can't, if the prongs aren't in the nostrils, then you can't transmit anything the baby is generating
trigger from the table. So that would be straightforward.
So there are two possible solutions. One, if the baby is not a very low birth weight infant, there is a decrease in the pressure, so there is an alarm who tells you that there was a disconnection. In very low birth weight infants, the resistance of the prongs is so high that also, if there is a disconnection, the decrease of the pressure could be not enough to activate the alarm. For this reason, now we are trying to resolve this problem in a baby who is actively breathing, that if in 10 seconds, in 15 seconds, you don't see, the machine doesn't detect a triggered breath, it sounds. But I suggest you to, the machine is here, and you will see that there is a nasal prongs, one closed with a balloon and the other completely open. So leak 50%. Try to move, to shift the balloon, very, very short movement, and you will see how nice the signal is.